If I were to ask you a hypothetical question around, I have a 10 by 3 foot space, what should I plant in there to maximize the value of that space? If you were to answer me, you should actually answer me by asking a few follow-up questions first. Things like, where do you live? What does well naturally in your zone? Who are you selling to? When do you need blooms? How consistently do you need blooms? How much can you fetch per stem of different varieties? What does the cost labor input look like for that? Those are just a few of the questions that you should be asking yourself. Now, if you're new to my channel, my name is Jessie. I am in zone 7A in central New Jersey, and I typically focus my YouTube videos on the business side of things. This time of year, we are all planning for the upcoming season. And in my last video, I talked about how as I enter into year 3 of flower farming, I am thinking about planning a little bit more differently. In fact, I plan now at a much higher level than in year 1. In year 1, when you're totally new and you're just super excited, you tend to just jump into things and dig into the weeds. So for example, I knew I was going to sell at a farmer's market. I wanted to sell at least 20 bouquets a week. So immediately I asked myself, well, how many plants of zinnias do I need? How many snapdragons do I need in order to get 20 bouquets a week? And while that is a really great and necessary exercise, I actually think that is an exercise that comes later down the road. So for me right now, what I like to do is I like to think about things from a 30,000 foot view. I like to think about things to help me inform, 1, am I going to have gaps throughout the season? 2, based off of what my high level plan looks like, will I be able to achieve my objectives, especially given the sales outlets that I am selling to, and I am selling to both wholesale and retail. So my last video, I started talking about just looking at the 12 months of the year, what I am planting, when will things bloom from a month perspective? And that will give me a better idea of the gaps in the seasons that I have, as well as when I will be most busy. But in this video, I want to flip the script a bit. I want to talk about it from the perspective of in a growing space area, because growing space is a finite resource. We don't have acres upon acres. And even for those of us who have a lot of acreage, we often realize that it is a lot easier to plant in a smaller space than try to manage a much bigger space. So given the limited space that we have, the question for you is, have you thought about planning based off of the space that you have versus what you would like to plant? So this is the exercise that we're going to go through today. We're just going to talk about 4 crops, and we're going to talk about this concept of crop turnover and how that impacts how you can maximize a space. But it's not just about crop turnover. There's other variables and factors that you need to consider. And one of the biggest things that you need to consider is just who are you selling to and when do you need those stems? So without further ado, let's dive into those examples. For my 4 examples, I am going to focus on 4 crops that I feel are relatively popular for flower farmers to grow. They are sunflowers, snapdragons, lisianthus, and dahlias. And the really interesting thing that you're going to see from this is that these 4 crops range from the spectrum of low value in terms of per stem value that they fetch to high end. And if you maximize the successions in the same space growing area, so we're talking about a 3 by 10 foot growing area, you will actually see a relatively similar level of revenue here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how many plants can you fit into a 3 by 10 foot space for each of these 4 crops. What is the value per stem you could fetch, at least at a wholesale value? Now, I am using my personal experience. Again, I live in New Jersey. I'm not necessarily in an urban area, but when I sell wholesale to florists through a floral cooperative, and the florists that buy from us are designers that use these stems in events like weddings, showers. So we do get what I would think is higher end of the spectrum when it comes to wholesale. But for the purposes of this exercise, we're comparing the 4 crops relative to each other. So it should still serve as a good baseline for you. Let's first quantify what this 3 foot by 10 foot growing space looks like. And I like to think about it in the form of Hortanova netting and how much of that netting can span that space. So because each square in the Hortanova netting is 6 by 6 inches, what that means is that in a 3 foot space, you can fit 6 squares, and a 10 foot space, you can fit 20 squares. So effectively in a 3 by 10 3 by 10 foot area, you can fit 120 total squares. So with that context in mind, let's get started with first sunflowers, which are one of my favorite crops to grow for retail. And in a 3 by 10 foot space, we're looking at realistically around 240 sunflower plants. You can probably go a little bit higher, you can probably go a little bit lower. 240 is going to give you the nice type of size heads for mixed bouquets. Now we are also talking about things like pro cuts where they are one and done. So we're not talking about branching sunflowers. Now, the thing that's great about sunflowers is that they are day length neutral, which means that whether or not it's early spring or at the height of the summer, you can expect about 60 days to maturity. I have found the crops to be much higher turning in the height of summer at around 45 days. So what that means is that sunflowers are a very, very fast turning crop. They may not be the most sexy flower in the sense that they're not gonna fetch you a high value per stem, but because they turn over so quickly, you could hypothetically use the same space multiple times, in my case, 3 successions to maximize your growing area. Now, we are not taking into consideration here crop rotation, which we should definitely all practice. We also should practice putting back into the soil the nutrients that we took out of it through growing plants. But I just wanted to demonstrate if you had one space and you wanted to intensively farm, what would that look like? So sunflowers, out of the 4 examples, are the most intensive when it comes to turning a space. So if you can get 3 successions out of that, what that means is that at $1.25-ish per stem, we can maximize our value at $900 for those 3 successions, assuming that one succession is about $300 worth. So $900 for that one small space is a decent amount of money, especially when you consider how low labor sunflowers are. First of all, you can direct seed in there, assuming you can avoid the birds from eating the seeds. You can also start them from plugs, but obviously direct seeding is a lot less labor intensive. Sunflowers, once they germinate, don't need a lot of water. They have very deep taproot systems. So if you have clay-like soil, that's really great for growing sunflowers. And last but not least, they don't need a lot of fertilizer. In fact, I have never needed to use fertilizer with my sunflowers. I find that they are also just very good at improving soil health because of those deep taproots. So sunflowers, a great retail type of flower for you to grow that can fetch close to $1,000 in the span of 3 successions, which is 2 60 days or 3 60-day cycles, right? So we're talking about half a year roughly. The next flower I want to talk about is snapdragons. Snapdragons are a very popular cut flower for both retail and florists alike. Believe it or not, you can really jam those snapdragons into each Hortanova square. So I started planting 3 per Hortanova square. If you buy from plugs, you will often see 2 snap seedlings in a single plug cell, and they are not meant to be divided. They are meant to just sit together happily in that plug and for you to put that into the ground. So Dave Dowling, as well as Steve and Gretel, who regularly appear on Lisa Mason Ziegler's podcast, all talk about growing 3 per Hortanova square. I did that this year and I saw that they actually did relatively well, even though my snaps got overtaken by thrips. So that's 360 snaps in 120 squares in this 3 by 10 foot area. That's a lot, because snaps at the end of the day can command a higher stem value than sunflowers. And for the first succession or the first bloom, we are talking about not pinching the snapdragon, just one long stem that is high quality enough for you to sell to a florist. I've put the pricing here conservatively at $1.50 a stem. I have definitely seen it go higher if you have a nice tall single stem. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's assume that it's $1.50, which means that you can get $540 off of one succession. The nice thing about snapdragons is that you might be able to get a second flush. For most of us who live in a growing zone where there is a relatively decent growing season, snaps will bloom earlier in the season as well as later in the season when the weather is cooler. Now, there are definitely certain snaps that will also continue blooming throughout the summer. My personal experience is that my snaps, even though I planted groups that were more specific for the summer, did not do as well as snaps that grew during the cooler times of year. So assuming that you keep those snaps in that same bed, you don't do anything to turn it, you just fertilize it a bit, you might need to water it, you can get a second flush. And that second flush will send you multiple shoots because your first cut has now acted as a pinch. So let's just say that you get a couple of stems out of them and we're averaging per stem less, but let's just say that you get the same revenue out of that second succession. So now we're looking at roughly $990 out of that area. So $990 for a full season in that same space compared to sunflowers, very close at $900. Now let's talk about another crop where you can also cram them a bit more tightly, but it's a much higher value crop, and we're talking about Lisianthus. So similar to snapdragons, I also plant 3 per square. I think most people usually push it at most to 2 per square. I had high success pushing it at 3 per square. So at 3 per square, we are talking about 360 plants, and we are also looking at 2 possible successions. Now, the problem with Lisianthus is that the second flush is usually inferior to the first flush, meaning that you're gonna get shorter stems and the blooms are not going to be as, there's not gonna be as many bloom heads. So the per stem value of the second flush is definitely going to be lower than the first flush. But the first flush, I would say you can fetch usually at least around $2.50 a stem wholesale, at least where we sell. The second flush, probably around $1.50 a stem. So that means that the revenue for the first succession is about $900 alone. Now, if you add the second flush at $1.50 a stem, you're looking at roughly $1,425. That is, in my view, the best case scenario. You're probably not going to get stems off of every single one of those 360 stems in or plants in the second flush. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's just assume that we're talking about max potential here, right? So you're looking at $1,400 for this little space with Lisianthus. The problem is that I often see beginner growers not being able to find the market that will properly compensate them for this crop. So for example, newer growers I see when they're selling to florists, they're not able to get more than $2 a stem. For retail customers, even though they're willing to pay a little bit more, they're usually not willing to pay like $4 or $5 a stem. And when you think about how much time Lisianthus needs in the ground, it needs to go in early spring. You need to baby it and make sure it's growing strong. But once it settles into the ground and it's really, really hot, it actually does well. And it's kind of a set it and forget it, with the exception of needing to weed. So it is a longer term crop. It is a crop that is more labor intensive, and it's a crop that only works if you can find a customer that is willing to pay for the price that you need them to pay. And assuming that you can find that customer, it is clearly a relatively higher revenue generating crop. Now, the last crop I want to talk about is dahlias here. Dahlias differ from everything else here from the standpoint that, one, it takes up a lot more space, and primarily it's because it's grown from a tuber and it's very, very bushy once it establishes. So in a 3 by 10 foot growing space, we're talking about roughly 14 dahlias that you can fit into this space. Now, dahlias have high productivity, and I would say that on average, you could probably expect about 20 stems. That being said, in my personal experience, there are certain dahlias where I only got like 3 stems. There are some where I got 10 stems. There are some where I got like over 30 stems. It kind of it's all over the place, right? So when you think about a high productive type of dahlia plant for cut flowers, let's think about something like a ball dahlia. So we're gonna put an average of 20 stems per dahlia plant, assuming you're letting it bloom for at least 2 months here. So what that means is that you're getting 168 plants per succession here. And when you look at per price stem it can fetch, we're usually selling it at about $2.50. I would say that some other people have success selling it upwards of $3, but for us at our co-op, we sell it for $2.50, which means that your single succession of dahlias for these 14 plants is about $700. Now that clocks in lower than the 3 other crops that I talked about. But remember, dahlia tubers do multiply. You can get more dahlias next year. Obviously, dahlia tubers are typically a higher upfront cost investment, and they do take a lot of time to establish in the soil. Again, you are getting them into the ground sometime in the spring, and they're usually not blooming until summer to late summer at the earliest, and then you get that peak during early fall. So for all of these, for all of that, it's not a bad value crop, assuming that you can find, again, the right market to pay for that kind of price. So I laid this out in some detail. I actually have it in a lot more detail on my Patreon page. I'll link it below. It's $5 a month. It gives you access to gated content such as this, and it really helps support me make content like this. So you can get more details on that Patreon page, and I even have zinnias in there too as another example. But the purpose of this exercise is, one, to see, okay, if I have crops that are going to fetch me relatively the same amount of revenue, what are the implications for when I would potentially get blooms? Am I going to have gaps? And what is the amount of effort associated with maximizing that space? So for example, if you need multiple successions to achieve the maximum value out of sunflowers, do you have something like an earthway seeder that can potentially minimize the cost of labor? It's very different direct seeding through an earthway seeder, just walking up and down a row, versus putting a seed in individual, like every 3 inches, or even starting from plugs, right? So you got to factor that into the equation here. You also got to factor in, hey, if I'm growing a lot of snaps and I'm going to have them blooming all relatively around the same time, which is like spring and fall, I'm gonna have a gap in that space during the summer. Do I have another crop that will take the place of snapdragons for whatever use I need them for in a separate space? Another question you might ask yourself is, if I have something like zinnias where I will need multiple successions in order for me to maximize that space, am I better off buying plugs during certain parts of the year, even though zinnias are super easy to start from seed? You might not want to be direct seeding at the height of summer when there's a lot of weed pressure. You might want to actually buy from plugs because you're not going to have time to start seeds indoors. Are you going to have your seed rack set up and all that stuff, right? So things like this give you a much better idea of how to plan, especially during the times of year when you are most busy. But I think most importantly, if you know what your sales outlets are going to be, when you expect yourself to be busy in terms of when you need the most amount of blooms, based off of what you are planning to grow and how you are maximizing that space, will you have any gaps throughout your season, right? So again, like I go back to sunflowers. Sunflowers, you will probably consistently have them throughout the season. You're going to have 3 successions. Things like lisianthus, they're going to come at the same time, sometime at the height of summer in like mid to late July, early August. So you're using all that space for something that blooms really just through like a 3 or 4 week window with the potential of a second flush. Something like a dahlia, also going to take up a lot of space for most of the season, and you are going to get a prolonged bloom time. But again, that bloom time is going to be later on the season. So have you planned accordingly to make sure that you have flowers throughout the gaps in the years or in the time of the season when those flowers cannot achieve blooms for you? So now that you've heard all of this, what should you do with the information? Well, first of all, do you know what your growing space looks like and what you're working with? And second, do you have objectives or goals that you want? So for example, for me, I actually want to turn the beds as little as possible. I don't necessarily want to intensively crop on every single bed. I obviously want to give some of the beds time. I would love to cover crop next year and really practice more regenerative growing principles. But for me, it's also just the labor thing. I want to turn the beds as little as possible. So I will have about a 3 by 10 foot growing space for sunflowers that will obviously need to turn more repeatedly, but I will be planting things like lisianthus, dahlias, things that overwinter and technically perennialize in my zone. And the things that perennialize, obviously, I am not going to be doing much with those beds other than making sure that I am mulching them with like things like leaf compost, taking care of them, weeding them. But my goal is actually to minimize my labor as much as possible. And based off of that, now I know, okay, my dahlias, my lisianthus, Those are two important focals that are going to take me from, we'll call it August, all the way till frost. So I don't need to necessarily worry about focals during that time of year. So I'm not going to be, I don't think, growing lilies until after frost, right? So I'm going to time my succession of lilies to come after frost. Now, what that also means is that before August, all the way up till, we'll call it after tulip season, I don't necessarily have focals, right? I'll have other things blooming. I want to make sure that everything blooms together at the same time. I want to make sure when I have gaps, that the gaps also all happen relatively within the same time. What good is it to have things like delphinium growing just by themselves when there's nothing else to accompany them, right? So I think that this type of planning is really important if you haven't thought about it at this level. And then after, when you're done with that, you can go into the details and say, okay, how many plants do I need of X, Y, and Z? And what does that look like in terms of, do I need to order plugs? When do I need to order those plugs? And then from that, you can even back out, okay, then this bed needs to turn at this time. I have X amount of days to turn it, and then X amount of days to get the plugs in, and so forth. So hopefully this gives you a much better idea of how to plan time-wise and labor-wise for 2024. I would love to hear what your thoughts are in the comments below around things that are high value crops for you that are either fast turning or slow turning, if you disagree with anything that I say in this video, or if you have any questions. So let me know in the comments below. Subscribe to this because this is the first of many videos that we are going to be talking about related to planning, the business aspect of flower farming. We're going to be diving into things like the phantom costs of flower farming, meaning the costs that you don't think about, but that quickly add up in the background and make it very difficult for us to achieve profitability. We're going to be talking about marketing, specifically how to grow that base of customers when you're just starting out. We're going to talk about like specific tactics and things that you can do. So a lot to come this winter. Make sure you're subscribed if you haven't below. Check out my Patreon again if you are looking for more details, and I will see you in the next video.